Something has shifted inside Russia, not on the battlefield, inside the country itself. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin governed through a simple, brutally effective formula: total control of information, total control of dissent, and a population that understood criticism carried real personal risk. That formula did not need to convince anyone Putin was right. It only needed people to be afraid enough to stay quiet. That fear is no longer working the way it used to, and the evidence for that claim is not coming from Western intelligence agencies or opposition activists in exile. It is coming from inside the Kremlin's own former officials, from Russia's own state economists, and from the Russian leader's own admissions, made on camera in front of his own government. Let's start with the economy, because this is where the cracks are most measurable and most undeniable. During a televised meeting on the economy, Putin revealed that GDP shrank by a combined 1.8% in January and February, adding that manufacturing, industrial production, and construction were negative. He said, "I expect to hear detailed reports today on the current economic situation and why the trajectory of macroeconomic indicators is currently below expectations. Moreover, below the expectations of not only experts and analysts, but also the forecasts of the government itself and the Central Bank of Russia." Think about what it means for a leader who has spent 2 decades projecting total command over every detail of Russian governance to admit, on state television, that his own numbers are coming in worse than his own government predicted. Putin himself acknowledged that the economy had contracted by 1.8% since the start of the year. The military Keynesian turn launched in 2022, which fueled rapid growth in 2023 to 2024, appears to have run its course. Now let's look at exactly why that engine has stalled, because the numbers behind it are genuinely staggering. Russia's federal budget deficit reached a staggering 5.9 trillion rubles, around 2.5% of GDP in the first 4 months of 2026 alone. This already exceeds the full-year deficit of 2025, which was 5.6 trillion rubles, and that figure had only recently alarmed economists. For all of 2026, the government had originally planned a deficit of just 3.9 trillion rubles. Compare those numbers honestly. A government planned for a deficit of 3.9 trillion rubles for the entire year. It blew past 5.9 trillion rubles in just the first third of that year. That is not a minor miscalculation. That is a fundamental breakdown in the financial planning of a state that has staked everything on its ability to keep funding a war indefinitely. But high interest rates and an expensive ruble are suffocating the civilian economy. Businesses are starved of credit, while domestic producers become less competitive. The result has been a wave of bankruptcies and small business closures. Workers laid off from civilian sectors are moving, where wages are still stable, into defense plants financed directly by the state. This is what economists describe as guns instead of butter, and it is happening in real time. The Kremlin operates according to a single logic: everything for the front, everything for victory. But sustaining the war machine is eroding Putinism's own social base. Every ruble funneled into tank production and missile manufacturing is a ruble not available for ordinary Russian businesses, ordinary Russian jobs outside the defense sector, and ordinary Russian household budgets. The value-added tax has been raised for the second time. Since the invasion began, utility prices are being increased twice in 2026. The central bank maintains punishingly high interest rates that make credit nearly inaccessible for small and medium-sized businesses, while helping sustain a strong ruble, which is vital for the military sector that depends heavily on imported, mostly Chinese components. This is the honest, comparative trap the Kremlin has built for itself. Keep the ruble strong, and Russia can keep importing the components its war machine needs from China. But a strong ruble simultaneously crushes the competitiveness of ordinary Russian exporters and businesses, who cannot sell their goods abroad as profitably and cannot get affordable credit at home. The ballooning deficit has also forced spending cuts. Public sector jobs are being reduced. Construction, infrastructure, and urban development projects are being scaled back. This hurts not only workers, but also thousands of officials, contractors, directors, and state-dependent business owners whose incomes relied on public spending. And here is the detail that should genuinely alarm anyone trying to read the political temperature inside Russia right now. Even the leader of Russia's Putin loyalist Communist Party recently warned that economic collapse could provoke a revolution like in 1917. A Putin loyalist politician invoking 1917, the year that ended Russia's monarchy entirely, is not rhetoric anyone in the Kremlin uses lightly. That comparison tells you exactly how seriously even regime-aligned figures are taking the trajectory of this crisis. Now let's be fully honest about the comparative picture here, because not every economist agrees this adds up to collapse. The ruble is strong, and so we're not seeing any comprehensive loss of confidence, though the flow of money in and out of Russia is tightly controlled. Overall, Russia's fiscal position remains really quite conservative. The Russian deficit is 2.5% of GDP in the first 4 months of this year, which is less than half what America is running as a deficit. It's a really mixed picture. It's just not growing at the rate that it was. It's disappointing. It's apparently causing political stress. After contracting mildly in the first quarter of 2026, Russia's growth is now expected to be as little as 0.4% over the whole year, which is kind of in the same ballpark as Germany. This is the realistic caveat that any honest analysis has to include. Russia's economy is not Greece in 2010, with banks failing and capital fleeing the country uncontrollably. It is something more specific and, in some ways, more insidious. A wartime economy that grew artificially fast for 2 years through military spending, and that is now running out of room to keep growing, that way without breaking something else in the process. A case in point is the view of one of Russia's leading mathematicians, academician Robert Nigmatulin, who told the Moscow Economic Forum in April 2026 that Russia's economy is experiencing an existential crisis. This is no way to run the economy, he said. The existing situation is a threat to the stability of the president's rule, under conditions of war fatigue and horrific corruption. The crisis will last long, and we are obligated to warn the president and society. The dissident economist Igor Lipsitz concurs, stating that Putin's Russia is in worse shape than Leonid Brezhnev's Soviet Union and is rapidly degrading. Compare Putin to Brezhnev, the Soviet leader whose late-era stagnation became shorthand for a system that had stopped functioning and simply coasted on inertia until it finally cracked apart. That is not a comparison Russian economists make casually, and the fact that it is being made openly at a public economic forum signals something about how much room for honest internal critique still exists, even inside a heavily controlled information environment. Now let's turn to the elite dimension of this story, because this is where the cracks become genuinely political rather than purely economic. Russians are starting to acknowledge that President Vladimir Putin has led the country to a dead end and can't shape its future, according to a former senior official in the Kremlin. In a recent Economist op-ed authored anonymously, the former official pointed out that fellow government peers in Moscow, regional governors and businessmen have stopped using the first-person plural when describing Putin's actions. In other words, Russia's elites found a subtle way to no longer express solidarity with Putin, describing what he does rather than what we do. That linguistic shift is small, almost invisible to an outside observer, but inside a political culture built entirely on projecting unity, the move from we to he is a genuinely significant signal. It is the language of distancing, of officials who want to survive whatever comes next without having tied their own personal fate too closely to a leader whose decisions they no longer feel comfortable owning. This connects directly to the broader pattern Russia watchers have noted for months. 4 years after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia is facing a spring of discontent. That discontent is not expressed through street protests, which remain dangerous and rare in Russia's tightly controlled environment. It is expressed through exactly the kind of subtle elite repositioning described above. Businessmen, regional governors, and former officials quietly putting daylight between themselves and the man at the top, while remaining careful never to cross into open, public defiance. Now let's address the military dimension, because the same pattern of strained confidence is visible at the front as well. Russia is now on the back foot in its war with Ukraine, having recently crossed the threshold of 1 million total casualties while its spring offensive collapses without having made any major gains. The pace of Russia's offensive, which had continued in some form for more than 2 years, slowed sharply in early 2026. In February, Ukrainian forces reportedly recaptured more territory than they lost for the first time since 2023. Russian casualties, according to pro-war military bloggers, also increased 1 million total casualties. That is the kind of number that, in almost any other political system, would trigger an immediate and visible reckoning. In Russia's tightly managed information environment, it instead gets absorbed, minimized, and redirected into state messaging about resilience and sacrifice. But absorbed does not mean invisible. A serious setback came when Russian access to Starlink terminals was reportedly disrupted at Ukraine's request. It became clear that Russia lacks an adequate alternative system of battlefield communications. This is the comparative reality worth sitting with. Since 2024, the Kremlin had been confident that Russia's war in Ukraine was moving toward inevitable victory. Moscow had weathered Western sanctions, dominated the battlefield and military production, and retained clear resource advantages. Time itself seemed to be on President Vladimir Putin's side. That confidence, built over years of grinding territorial gains and Western hesitation, is now colliding with a spring in which the offensive stalled, casualties mounted, past a historic threshold, and the economic engine funding it all started visibly straining under its own weight. So where does this actually leave the regime? The honest, realistic answer sits firmly between two extremes that dominate most coverage of this topic. This is not the imminent collapse that some breathless commentary suggests. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook foresees Russia's economic growth slowing down to 1.4% in 2025 and 1.2% in 2026, but it is still expected to grow. A country still technically growing, even slowly, even painfully, is not a country on the immediate verge of disintegration. Putin retains the security services, the propaganda apparatus, and the legal machinery to suppress overt political opposition, and nothing in the current economic data suggests those tools have weakened. But this is also clearly not the stable, confidently advancing war machine the Kremlin projected even a year ago. Facing growing industrial and manpower constraints, Russia must soon decide whether to forcibly mobilize its economy and society for its war against Ukraine. The consequences for Russia's stability and Europe's security will be profound. That is the real fork in the road. Not collapse versus stability, but a far harder choice between further, more painful mobilization of Russian society and resources to sustain the war, or some form of strategic retrenchment that the Kremlin has spent 4 years insisting it would never need to make. Either path carries serious political risk for a leader whose authority has depended for 2 decades on appearing to never face hard choices at all. The shield of fear that has protected Putin's rule was never really about preventing every act of dissent. It was about making dissent feel pointless, isolated, and certain to fail. What the data emerging from inside Russia's own economic institutions, its own former officials, and its own loyalist political figures suggests is not that fear has disappeared. It is that for a growing number of people inside the system, the calculation of what staying silent actually protects has started to change. That shift, quiet, internal, and still far from open rebellion, may ultimately matter more for Russia's future than any single battlefield outcome in Ukraine.